Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about Arlington National Cemetery. We don't talk about it too much, about how it began or its history, but it's a rather fascinating one. Of course, the property belonged to the Washingtons. Of course, George Washington was married to Martha Custis, and Martha Custis had several children. They had no children of their own, but Washington adopted her children, and of course, as time went on, that property, which was the Washington Custis property, was developed, and by the early part of the 19th century, buildings had been constructed. I think in the second decade of the 19th century, Arlington House was completed, and it was a Park Custis estate. Amazingly, in time, the property was ceded to the wife of Robert E. Lee. Excuse me. Now, Robert E. Lee, of course, was a very well-known military officer. He was a graduate of West Point and famous for not getting demerits. In fact, he was so good at following rules. It was amazing. And he was of the old world in the way of a Virginian. It's an interesting thing. Years ago, we didn't think of the states. We thought them more as countries. It was often the comment during the Declaration of Independence saying, wouldn't you like to go back to your own country? And that's how they often spoke about their states. And when you had the Articles of Confederation, it was more or less your own country. But Robert E. Lee became the administrator of that estate and of slaves and all of that, and the home was called Arlington House. What was also very important is everything from Mount Vernon that was important or sacred, having belonged to George Washington, was in that house. And they lived there for many years, Robert E. Lee and his wife. Now, Robert E. Lee was no slouch historically either in the way of his family tree. Richard Henry Lee was very famous because the Declaration of Independence was based on the resolution by Richard Henry Lee, and Harry Lighthorse Lee was his father. Another thing that's kind of fascinating is that Robert E. Lee was well known in his circles for always being prim and proper, and not always having the greatest sense of humor, but always devoted to duty. And there was a lot of things going on in the United States in the latter 1850s leading into the 1860s, and that was sectional strife, the issues of slavery, states' rights, tariffs, and of course, basically, money became major topics and started to tear the country apart. There was a new political party which shook up the Democrats in the South, and that was the Republicans. Now, they had their first candidate in 1856, John Fremont, who almost won, but he was defeated by James Buchanan, who ran on the ticket of not knowing anything, which I always found rather fascinating. But in 1860, with all the sectional strife going on, the Democratic Party split in several different factions, which guaranteed that the Republicans were going to win. Whenever a political party splits, you can almost always guarantee that the winner will be the other party. And Lincoln won with nowhere near a plurality of the population. In fact, his name wasn't even listed in the South to be elected. And the thing is, as soon as Lincoln was elected, shock and horror went through the South, and of course South Carolina seceded, and followed by several other states. Virginia didn't go initially, and Robert E. Lee was steadfast in his dedication to the Union. Now, he had been in the military for over 30 years. And, well, as soon as Virginia went, Lee had to decide, was he an American or was he a Virginian? It's an interesting thing. That's the way people thought years ago about their country. And he finally came to the understanding that where Virginia goes, he went. And he resigned his commission in the military. Of course, General Scott told him that you're making the greatest mistake you've ever made in your life, which in many respects would become true. But Lee left Arlington House in April. His wife stayed there. Now, here's where it gets rather fascinating. She owned the property, and she kept trying to pay her taxes, and they wouldn't accept them. And eventually, the federal government took the property for lack of paying taxes. Very interesting thing. They wouldn't accept the taxes, but then they took it because there were no taxes sent to them. It was wartime, and she left and escaped and left everything in the house, including all of the sacred relics of George Washington. Many of the things that you see today that are in the Smithsonian dealing with George Washington were in Arlington House. It's an important thing to remember. And that became an outpost for the military. They took it over with very, very deliberate instructions not to damage anything. Once the war started and casualties were piling up, it became a matter of course we didn't want the Lees to come back to that house because we were angry at them. So Abraham Lincoln said, go ahead, bury individuals. And the first place they buried individuals on the property was right around the house. So they put graves all around the house so the Lees wouldn't want to go back. And Mrs. Lee was famous for her rose garden and her flower beds, and that's where they did lots of burials. And before long, the property was getting pretty filled with corpses. You got to remember how many people were killed in the American Civil War. Do you know there's like close to 700,000 people killed? It's an amazing number. So after the Civil War, it was finally decided, and there were court cases with the Lee family to purchase the property. And they did. Although the Lees were fighting it out well into the 20th century over that property. And of course, it has become now a national cemetery ever since the American Civil War. And Arlington House is now a museum dedicated to many different things, but also to the Lees. The interesting thing about Arlington National Cemetery, it's getting filled up now. It's running out of space. And now if you wish to be buried, well, of course you have to be in the military or served in a post in government dealing with military affairs. And now they prefer to have cremated remains, so it takes up less space. Although they will take casketed remains of certain individuals. There was a period of time that you could build memorials as large as you like. And there's a section of the cemetery where you see these monstrous Victorian monuments. Of course, today, very simple headstones. And if you look, you'll see the headstones all the way across the cemetery in beautiful, perfect lines. We have 2 presidents buried in Arlington National Cemetery. One is John F. Kennedy, which most people are aware of. The other most people are not aware of, and that's William Howard Taft, who holds a very unique distinction in the American presidency. He was not only the President of the United States, but also he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as well. So those two presidents are buried on the site. Interesting thing, a lot of times there's trivia. People always say how many presidents are buried in Washington, D.C. One, Woodrow Wilson. Kennedy and Taft are buried in Virginia, not Washington, D.C. Just something interesting to mention. Today, Arlington Cemetery is a place of reverence. I have gone there many times and walked around and seen some folks that I knew who are now interred there. And it will be open for perhaps the next 50, 60 years or so, maybe a little bit more, until it's completely filled up. And at that point, it'll become more of a park, a historic park, a place of remembrance rather than of burials. But it's an important place in our country's history, but also the fact of how it was started. Through tax evasion. That's how the property, more or less, began. And so today, 2 presidents, many generals, many chief justices are interred in that sacred property, which today is referred to as hallowed ground in the history of the United States, Arlington National Cemetery. Thank you.